My name is Heinz Gärtner. On behalf of the International Institute for Peace, I want to welcome you to this meeting. We have a global crisis of multilateralism in general, but also the OSCE, the Organization on Security and Cooperation in Europe, has difficulties now. So we will talk about this, about multilateralism, arms control, the attack on international organization in general, but in particular, of course, on the OSCE. And we have the privilege here to speak to Professor Terrence Hopmann. He is with the Johns Hopkins University in Washington, and he is the most famous expert in the US on the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and now the organization of the Conference on Security and Cooperation. And he has a very lengthy CV, but I mention just a few career points of him. So he was the director of the crisis management program of the Johns Hopkins University. He was professor and chair of the political science department at Brown University, and he was also director of the global security program. He was professor of political sciences, University of Minnesota, and director of its Center for International Study. And he also served as a president of the vice president of the International Studies Association. He was also editor of the prestigious journal International Studies Quarterly. And also he was Fulbright professor in Belgium, but also here in Austria, where we met the first time. And he was also senior fellow at the United States Institute for Peace and the Woodrow Wilson Center. He holds a PhD of Stanford University. So Terry, you accompanied the Conference on Security and Cooperation, the CSC, from the beginning. So give us some information why the CSD was established, how important was it during the Cold War. So just give us some headlines and some guidance that we understand history a little bit as well.
Right. Well, I had the fortunate opportunity to be on sabbatical at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace's office in Geneva in 1974 during the primary negotiation phase of the Helsinki Final Act. The process began in Helsinki in 1973 and concluded again in Helsinki in 1975, but the vast majority of the negotiations took place in the intervening period in Geneva, and I had an opportunity then to interview virtually all of the major delegates from the participating states in the initial drafting of the Helsinki Final Act, which was, I think, really an important breakthrough in the Cold War because it came, of course, at a time of very high East-West tension and became also an opportunity for many of the neutral and non-aligned countries of Europe to exercise more influence on that relationship than at any other prior time, really, in the history of the Cold War. And through the evolution of its various review conferences, the last of which was held in Vienna in the late 1990s, late 1980s, I think it really played a major role in bringing about many of the changes of the Cold War by creating some concepts of cooperative security, military confidence building measures between NATO and the Warsaw Treaty Organization, as well as institutionalizing a variety of important principles of non-intervention in the internal affairs of states and respect for human rights and so forth as part of an international code of conduct. And then, of course, with the end of the Cold War, in the period in 1991 and 92 in particular, well, starting with the Charter of Paris in 1990, it really began to develop a more institutionalized structure, and in particular developed its missions of long duration to a number of conflict regions, as conflict was breaking out as the Cold War came to an end.
Let me just go back a little bit to the Helsinki Final Act. Reading the Helsinki Accords today, so you can't find a word like threat, enemy, adversary, foe. So looking at today's security strategies all over the world, they all speak about these enemies and foes. In the Helsinki Final Act, we also read about cooperative security, common security, what you mentioned. So in your assessment, is the world today falling behind Helsinki? Was Helsinki, in terms of international cooperation, far advanced than we are today?
In many ways, yes. I think in terms of many of the principles of the conduct of international relations. Now, not all of the principles of Helsinki were obviously implemented immediately. I mean, it took some time before we saw improvement in human rights situations in a number of countries, and a number of other provisions of Helsinki took really until the period beginning with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the conferences in Paris, Copenhagen, and later Helsinki again in 1992, to kind of create the post-Cold War structures. But yes, we are indeed falling behind in many ways. I mean, then at least, in spite of all of the conflicts and in spite of the certainly greater immediate threat of nuclear conflict, even between the United States and the Soviet Union in particular, many of the cooperative principles clearly have declined in recent years, and nationalism has reasserted itself, particularly, of course, compared to the period of the 1990s, the early Cold War period, when we really believed that mutual security, cooperative security might have a chance of becoming established as a really serious international norm. That's all been deteriorating. The other process that I was involved in studying during that period were arms control negotiations as well, and particularly I focused a lot on the negotiations on conventional arms control on MBFR, which brought me to Vienna virtually every year from 1974 and through 1990 to interview delegates again, which turned into the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, and also the INF Treaty, which has now collapsed. So we've seen virtually all of these agreements that were arrived at in the concluding years of the Cold War and in the post-Cold War period have all now expired, except for the New START Treaty, which may or may not survive the next few months. So we're in a really bad situation there. You talked about the OSCE now after the end of the Cold War, the Paris Charter, and what the OSCE developed then. It of course had a very different agenda than before. So one focus was, of course, conflict prevention, the OSCE missions. So how successful was the OSCE in this with this new environment? Did it live up to its expectations? The missions, and if we look at also at the Ukraine, and also if you look at the conflict what we have now between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So can you talk a little bit about conflict prevention in general, and more specific about the OSCE's role during that period? Sure. Well, of course, the main purpose of conflict prevention is to try to bring some international assistance to parties in conflict before they cross the Rubicon of violence, because once you've crossed that Rubicon of violence, so to speak, it becomes far more difficult to go back to the status quo ante and to reestablish the ties that existed before, because the conflict itself changes in its nature, because the consequences, the violence done by the conflict, the loss of human life and property and everything else created by the conflict makes resolution far more difficult than the initial issues that led to the conflict. Now, one of the problems we faced in the 1990s was that these conflicts began occurring particularly in the former Yugoslavia as well as in the Caucasus, really before the OSCE was really able to get up to speed and to have its full set of institutional structures on the ground. So very often, many of the missions focused far more really on post-conflict peace building in places like Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo than they did actually on conflict prevention. But there were, I think, a few successful cases of conflict prevention. The role of the OSCE in Macedonia, for example, was, I think, an important case of particularly the role of the High Commissioner on Peace, Max van der Stoel, in bringing about a reconciliation between the Albanian minority and the Macedonian majority, as well as preventing the from spilling over the border between Serbia into Macedonia. So that's, I think, one example of a fairly successful enterprise. I actually think, and wrote an article, a couple of articles actually, about the Crimea case in the 1990s, where again the High Commissioner played an important role in creating an agreement between the leadership of Crimea, which was predominantly ethnically identified as being Russian, and the government of Ukraine, allowing for a deep autonomy. And it all seemed to be working well, of course, until, frankly, for, I believe, more strategic reasons than matters of principle, the Russians decided to intervene in 2013. And it's the situation. But there again, I mean, the OSCE has at least come in, well, not obviously in preventing the initial conflict, but at least preventing it from security, had that conflict expanded to a more direct and immediate confrontation between regular Russian units and the Ukrainian military, perhaps with outside support. So it's had some modest success. It has the tools, but unfortunately, it's not really had a full enough buy-in on the part of political leadership. There's just not been enough political will on the part of some of the major powers in the world, particularly, and I blame to a large degree the United States and the Russian Federation, particularly for that, though also to some degree Europeans have focused more on the EU as its their primary orientation.
What could be done to deblock the situation in the OSCE if you talk about the more narrow institutional aspects? So you're talking about different blocks now within the OSCE, which hamper their efficacy. So what could be done to deblock now the situation?
I think this requires, it requires some more imaginative approach at a larger strategic level, which might feed back down into the OSCE, because again, the OSCE, like most international organizations, is what the participating states make of it. And if the participating states think it's important and is helpful in encouraging security and preventing war from breaking out, then it's far more likely to be successful. Whereas what we need, I think, is an ability, particularly between the United States and the Russian Federation. I mean, we've had this very strange relationship between Presidents Trump and Putin at one level, but that kind of, sort of top-level relationship has not really spilled over into the other aspects of the relationship. And what I know has happened in the United States, at least, is we've not really been able to distinguish between disagreeing with Russia about things that we consider to be violations of international norms and behaviors found in the Helsinki Final Act and in the Charter of Paris, but also trying to work together where we do have common interests, and to try to rebuild arms control and other efforts like that may then, again, as they did in the 1990s, and indeed in the late 1980s with the INF Treaty and the other agreements that Gorbachev and Reagan arrived at in the 1980s.
You talked about this relation between Putin and Trump, but after all, the Trump administration did send lethal weapons to the Ukraine government, so that doesn't really say that a good relationship between Russia and the US.
Well, I think, frankly, that decision was made in spite of the president, not because of the president. The money was appropriated by Congress, and by a Democratic Congress, in fact. And these were viewed largely, of course, as more defensive lethal weapons designed to deter any Russian attempt to move beyond the line of contact and to move further into Ukrainian territory. Um, but in trying to help the Minsk process, frankly, move forward. We tried to some degree, obviously, but got caught up in various efforts leading up to the current U.S. election when the people responsible for it got sort of sucked into this scheme.
Let's talk about another Minsk process, now the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So what are your thoughts about it? So that's...
Right, I wrote an article in the OSCE.
Can the OSCE play a role?
Yeah, I mean, I think I wrote an article in the OSCE yearbook in 2014, sort of developing a peace plan for the Nagorno-Karabakh issue, which I think is particularly still valid. I think the problem is that the Minsk group has played a fairly passive role, and their approach has been one of trying to go step by step with small confidence-building measures and deal with small issues. But they haven't really addressed what seems to me to be the critical issue, the big elephant in the room, if you like, of the political status of Nagorno-Karabakh itself. Because it seems to me that a solution depends on where Nagorno-Karabakh ends up. Is it part of Azerbaijan still, as formally under international law it is? Does it become independent? Does it attach to Armenia and so forth? And then if whatever decision is made there, which I think personally should be based upon a referendum of people living there, plus people who were living there when the conflict broke out in the early 1990s, then you need to compensate the other party. I mean, Armenian occupation of the 7 rayon of Azerbaijan outside of Nagorno-Karabakh cannot be justified as a long-term solution either. They need to withdraw. They need to guarantee rights of access between Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenia. And furthermore, I mean, there are a whole number of things that could be done if we reopen the borders and actually begin to try to develop perhaps a kind of mini economic community in the Southern Caucasus, perhaps bringing in Georgia as well to provide some more positive incentives for the parties to try to cooperate. Again, there's no solution that's going to meet everyone's perfect outcome. But I do think, on the other hand, it should be obvious from the latest round of violence that everybody's losing right now, and that a compromise solution is necessary. And I really think that particularly the 3 co-chairs of the Minsk group ought to be taking an even more active role in trying to set forward some of the kinds of proposals that were set forth at Key West back in the late 1990s again, and in other negotiations earlier on that tried to take a more holistic approach to the conflict rather than just trying to do it little bit by bit at a time. But that's going to take real leadership. I think to a larger degree, the U.S. and Russia and France have to some degree cooperated within the Minsk group more than they have in a lot of other ways. But on the other hand, they've not had until now the high-level support, it seems to me, of the governments, of the foreign ministers and of the heads of state to actually advance some really serious proposals and some serious efforts to try to bridge the gaps here. But I do think it's a solvable problem, in spite of the fact, of course, that there are these really long-term narratives about demonization of the other that are going to take a long time. And we're probably, whatever solution is arrived at, going to need some kind of peacekeeping mission, whether provided by the high-level planning group of the OSCE or by the UN, to assure security in the medium term, at least during a transitional period. But I do think there are political solutions out there if we're really willing to deal with the question of what is the status of Nagorno-Karabakh. I mean, without resolving that, every other issue really depends on who ends up controlling or what the international political status of Nagorno-Karabakh, or the Artsakh Republic, as they call themselves, is in international relations. And until that issue is addressed, you can't really determine how you respond to all of the other related issues about the return of IDPs, transportation and security throughout the region and things like that. It all needs to be dealt with, in my view, as a package and not just as a series of small steps, one at a time.
Okay. The final question, of course, I cannot avoid it. So American elections are approaching. So what does it mean for international relations in general? But let's talk about multilateralism. So the Europeans want to keep up multilateralism. As we talked before, multilateralism is in decline now, at least. It declined very much during the last 4 years of the Trump administration. So what can we expect, either one, if President Trump wins again, Biden will become president with all these arms control treaties. You already alluded to the START treaty, so that is one of the issues, but also the GCPOA, the Iran deal. So what is your global picture about multilateralism after the American elections? I know it's a big question, we have to be short, but a couple of minutes, can you please?
Sure. I'll try to be short as possible. Obviously, Trump's policy has been America first, which, of course, has some historic precedents going back to the late 1930s, and the position that America firsters took with respect to engagement in World War II. And I think that's been a disastrous policy, personally, for the United States. And I think the Biden administration, if it arrives, as appears likely but not certain, will restore a lot of these multilateral connections. It clearly will rejoin the Paris Climate Accords. It will, I believe, pursue arms control negotiations more actively than this administration has. I mean, the Trump administration has said, particularly with respect to START, that you've got to bring China in. But, bringing China in is a long-term process because the Chinese have not participated in these processes in the past. They still consider themselves, albeit now a major power in a way that they were not when New START was negotiated. They still consider themselves to be behind the U.S. and Russia. So bringing them in is a long-term process, which is why, in my view at least, we need immediately to use the 5-year extension of New START to allow time to perhaps revise, expand, and if possible, begin to bring China and perhaps other nuclear weapon states into the agreement. And to move on to other agreements in Europe as well, where, again, the deployment of intermediate range missiles in Europe is going to recreate a crisis that I observed on the ground when I was living in Belgium at the height of the Euro missile crisis in the early 1980s. And that would be a serious problem, I think. So we really do need to get back on the track with arms control. Virtually all of the major arms control agreements that were signed at various points during and particularly after the Cold War are gone.
Can we expect that the Congress will go along with it? And Biden, of course, if Biden would support this revival of multilateralism, arms control agreement, can we expect this?
Yes, no, that's a good question. The current polls suggest that there's, again, if the Biden administration wins, that there's a good chance that the Democrats will get they're almost certain to retain and even get a larger majority in the House of Representatives. And there's a reasonable chance that they will get at least 50 seats, if not 51 or 52 in the Senate. But even if they get 50 and Harris is vice president, she can become the tie-breaking vote on issues which require a majority vote. But of course, treaties require more than a majority vote in the U.S. Constitution. They require a 2/3 majority vote. And that's going to be difficult. I mean, it's virtually impossible to get the U.S. Senate to agree on a 2/3 majority about anything. So many of these agreements may have to be done as executive agreements, which makes them more fragile to future changes than real treaties, but they're better than nothing, at least. And as long as the American political system remains as divided as it is right now, and as long as the two parties will not support anything that the other party supports, it's going to be very, very hard to build the kind of consensus that we developed, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, around arms control, where leadership in both parties at least agreed to the ratification of many of the major assault, START, INF, et cetera, kinds of agreements that were arrived at during that period. It's going to be very hard to get back to that. So these may have to be done as executive agreements. But again, if there's will to observe them, that's still better than nothing.
Okay, Darren, thank you very much. It was for your insights, for your perspectives. It was very, very useful for our discussion. I hope we can come back to you after the new administration will be in power, and then we can look at the further developments in arms control and multilateralism, and also the OSCE. So it was great, Terry, to have you on here, and I wish you a nice day to Washington, and we will talk later again. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. You're very welcome. And it was a pleasure to be with you, and look forward to further communication in the future. Thank you.